why we support Bill 21. First of all, we should define secularism, the key issue here. It has based on 4 basic principles, which are enumerated in Bill 21. Equality for all citizens, which includes, of course, male-female equality. Freedom of conscience for everyone. Religious neutrality of the state. And separation between religions and state, the 4 basic principles. But religious neutrality, which is the second last one here, has several different interpretations. So when somebody talks about religious neutrality, you really need to get them to explain what they mean. There's strong neutrality, which means that there's neutrality among different religions and between religion and non-religion. That means that atheists and agnostics and other non-believers are considered on a par. Non-belief is on a par with belief. Then there's weak neutrality. That's when atheists and non-believers are excluded. And there's a lot of religious people who interpret it that way. That all they mean is that, you know, like Christians and Muslims are equal and Jews are equal or whatever, but it's like they don't, atheists and non-believers are not taken into account. It's like we don't exist. And then there's what I call the fake neutrality, which I will explain later, but there are some people who interpret neutrality as meaning that you can't remove religious privileges from the religious, otherwise you're treating them unequally, which is ridiculous. But I'll go into some detail about that a little later in the talk. Now, full secularism, there were the 4 principles, but one of them was freedom of conscience, and that must include both freedom of and from religion. That's very important, not just freedom of, but freedom from religion, so that atheists and other non-believers are included. The separation principle is very important. Without it, well, the point of secularism is to make sure that religions don't have political power, as well as making sure that the state doesn't interfere with religions either. But if you don't have separation, then that means that religion may have some political power or influence. Also, without separation, the other 3 principles are all compromised. You can't have true neutrality if religions have some kind of influence. Male-female equality may be compromised if there's no separation because many religions are misogynistic. And you know, the rights of people are compromised if religion has any influence in government. And the religious neutrality that's part of secularism must be of the strong type. If it's not, then atheists and other non-believers are excluded, they're discriminated against. And so this is how I see freedom of conscience visually. It includes both freedom of religion and freedom from religion. And it's incomplete unless they're both there. Freedom of conscience may include other freedoms as well, but when it comes to religion, of and from must both be there. And also included, you have to have the freedom to leave a religion. Freedom from religion includes the freedom to leave a religion. So that apostasy is a fundamental human right that's part of freedom of conscience. Now, Bill 21, just a moment. Isabeau, can you turn on your video camera? Welcome to the meeting, by the way. Can you hear me?
David, I think she's muted. Her computer is muted.
Yes, I see that. I'm asking her, I'm clicking on the button asking her to unmute. Oh well, I'll continue. Let's hope she figures it out. Now, Bill 21, what's good about it? It contains a clear definition of secularism, similar to the one I gave at the beginning. It adds this definition to the Quebec Charter, so it becomes legally recognized. It also defines what a religious symbol is. It bans religious symbols worn by civil servants in positions of authority, including school teachers. It bans face coverings, whether worn by civil servants on duty or by those receiving services. So the ban on face coverings is more extensive than the ban on religious symbols. And not all face coverings are religious. Some may not be religious, it depends. But they're banned because they're an impediment to security or communication or identification. Okay. Sorry, okay. Weaknesses. Okay, Bill 21 is certainly not perfect. There's a lot it doesn't do. The ban on religious symbols is limited to only part of the civil service, only to those in positions of authority. It applies only to teachers and principals in public schools, not to other personnel. It doesn't apply to private schools at all, nor to childcare centers at all. And it doesn't apply to MNAs, the members of the National Assembly. And that is inconsistent with the fact that the crucifix was removed from the wall of the National Assembly. That's a very good thing that they removed that. But at the same time, the MNAs shouldn't display religious symbols either. The personnel are just as important as the installations. And also, the law does not say that they have to remove symbols from the walls and such. I mean, they did remove the crucifix from the National Assembly. That's great, but that wasn't part of the law. And unfortunately, those few crucifixes that are still left, they don't have to be removed necessarily because of Bill 21. Now, there are other weaknesses as well. There's a grandfather clause, which means that those in positions of authority before the draft bill was first published in March of 2019, they can continue to wear religious symbols. This is not a good idea. This could be easily corrected by putting a time limit on it, saying 2 years or a year or something. But unfortunately, Bill 21 does not do that. Also, the fourth principle, freedom of conscience. The way it's written in the definition in Bill 21, it says freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Well, the second part is superfluous because freedom of conscience already includes freedom of religion. And if you're going to mention freedom of religion, you must mention freedom from religion as well. The two are equally necessary. So you should either say freedom of conscience and stop there, or you should say freedom of conscience and freedom of and freedom from religion. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to go that far, it's a good idea to mention freedom of apostasy because, as we know, there's at least one religion that makes apostasy extremely difficult, punished as a crime, and sometimes punishable by death in some countries. Bill 21 does not affect the considerable fiscal advantages granted to religious institutions. Quebec could easily take a giant step forward in this direction by dropping the advancement of religion as a criterion for a charitable organization. And that's a criterion which Quebec copied from federal legislation. Should get rid of that. Bill 21 does not reform the highly criticized ethics and religious culture program, which is compulsory at all levels in Quebec schools and indoctrinates children with a community-based and sugar-sweetened view of religions. And fortunately, there is a reform that has been promised since Bill 21, but we're not sure what form that's going to take. We have to keep our eyes peeled and be vigilant about that. Also, there's this may be a minor point, there's the dubious English translation. The title of Bill 21 in English uses the word laicity, which doesn't even exist in English. They should use the word secularism, even though the two words are not exactly the same. The word should be secularism. I'll explain more in a minute. They even use the word lay, where the word secular should be used. And lay has a completely different meaning, unrelated to religion in English. The English word lay just simply means somebody who's not a professional like a lay physicist is somebody who's not a professional physicist. So that's a bad translation. Now, I mentioned that laïcité in French and secularism in English, there is a subtle difference in that secularism tends to be weaker than laïcité. The principle of religion-state separation is given lesser importance in the English word. However, this difference should not be exaggerated. The English term nevertheless includes the separation principle. People outside Quebec who call themselves secular but oppose Bill 21 are being extremely hypocritical. Cultural differences may explain this situation, but they do not excuse the hypocrisy. If they call themselves secular, then they just need to be well informed and make a little intellectual effort to understand full secularism. For example, if the state allows police to wear religious symbols while on duty, then clearly the separation principle is violated. This is not difficult to understand. So we must stop excusing the hypocrisy and intellectual sloth of those who refuse to understand. If you're going to talk about secularism, then you've got to have separation. And that has implications for civil servants who wear symbols. Now, some constitutional considerations. It is often claimed that Bill 21 is incompatible with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but we don't know that. That's what the courts are going to decide. That's what this court challenge is all about. The complainants in the court challenge say that it's incompatible, but it's up to the courts to decide. It's important to remember that the 1982 Constitution, which includes the Canadian Charter at the beginning of it, is not some absolute reference handed down by the divinity to Moses, also known as Pierre Elliott Trudeau. It's a human and imperfect document written by human beings, and it begins with a reference to the supremacy of God. And it allows federal judges to invalidate democratically adopted provincial laws, which is a pretty serious bit of power there. But Quebec has never signed or approved of the 1982 Constitution, which means that although it's legally required to respect it, there's no moral obligation to respect it because it never signed it. And the courts have even ruled in the past, in the Ford decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, that it's beyond their jurisdiction to determine the wisdom of using the notwithstanding clause, as Bill 21 does. The wisdom of using that clause is a political question which only the legislator can decide. The courts only rule on it technically, whether it's technically legal or not. So if the courts do decide that Bill 21 violates the Charter, this will not be a moral decision, only a technical one. Maybe it means the Charter needs to be modified, not Bill 21. You know, there'll still be a debate. That doesn't mean that Bill 21 is horribly wrong if it violates the Charter. Now, before we continue, our guiding principles, the things our organization defends and works for. Now, of course, secularism, mentioned at the beginning. We also, of course, are an atheist organization defending the rights of atheists. Our goal is to maximize freedom of conscience of everyone, including ourselves, including atheists, but not to the detriment of others. It's important that we draw a distinction between believers and non-believers. Between beliefs and believers is what I mean, between ideas and people. In other words, people deserve respect, but ideas and ideologies do not. So, for example, we respect a person's right to practice a religion, but we don't respect the religion itself necessarily. We evaluate the religion, and if we don't think it's reasonable, we can criticize it. Also, it's very important to distinguish between race and religion, because the two are conflated a lot by the enemies of secularism. I think deliberately conflated as if they were the same thing, so that they can accuse secularists of being racist, which is nonsense. Race is a biological concept, but religion is an ideology. It's a collection of ideas and practices. They have nothing in common. And also, we're concerned about the indoctrination of children. It's really important to avoid that. That's why secularism in the school system is so important. Now, when dealing with separation between religion and state, there are not two spaces, there's three. There's the private space, of course, on the left in the diagram. And then there's, on the far right of the diagram, the civic space. That is state institutions and state employees. But in between is this whole public space, which is not like government, not a government institution or not a state institution. Public space like, you know, the street, shopping centers, businesses, everywhere that's public, which is not part of government or the state. And secularism involves mainly the civic space that is state institutions. And it doesn't affect the public space at all, or very little at least. So when people say that Bill 21, tries to remove religion from the public sphere, no, it doesn't. It tries to remove religion from state representatives while they're on the job. That's all, not from the public sphere. So it's important. The dotted line you see there is where the separation occurs. Now, a number of arguments in favor of Bill 21. If the state were to allow religious symbols to be worn by employees in the civil service and schools, first of all, it's incompatible with religious neutrality, just like a symbol like a crucifix on the wall or any other symbol on the wall would be incompatible with state religious neutrality. It's also, to allow them, would be incompatible with separation between religion and state. Furthermore, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in 2015 in the case which you've probably heard of involving the city of Saguenay prayers at municipal council meetings, where the Supreme Court struck down that, decided that those prayers cannot be allowed at municipal council meetings because they violate secularism. And that was a big victory for the MLQ. The Supreme Court stated that the state must neither encourage nor discourage any belief or non-belief. And then the decision also says the state itself cannot engage in a religious practice. So the practice would be one engaged in by one or more state officials who would have to be acting in the performance of their functions. In other words, what the Supreme Court is saying is that state only exists through its representatives. For the state to be neutral, its representatives must be neutral. The court did not express an opinion for or against the wearing of religious symbols by the state, by state representatives, but its decision is compatible with a ban. Indeed, the wearing of a religious symbol is a religious practice. So when the opponents of Bill 21 say, "Oh, it's only the state that should be neutral and not the employees," well, the employees are the state. The state does not exist except through its representatives, who are its employees. They are the state, so they need to be neutral, and they should not wear religious symbols. If the state allowed them to wear symbols, that would be a privilege granted to religions. It would be a religious accommodation, and such accommodations are never acceptable. The religious symbols constitute a form of religious advertising or proselytizing. And so a ban on wearing them removes the privilege of being allowed to practice such advertising on the job. And allowing such symbols to be worn, it would be discrimination against atheists, against other non-believers, and against believers who wear no symbols. And so banning them constitutes an anti-discriminatory measure, not discriminatory. Now, again, on the issue of discrimination, to ban religious symbols worn by state employees is not discriminatory. It applies equally to men and women, so there's no sex discrimination. Men wear religious symbols too. It applies to all religions, so there's no religious discrimination. Some religions, or some variants of certain religions, impose certain accoutrements on women as a sign that they are considered inferior to men. They may not use that word inferior, but that's what it means. Thus, the ban on religious symbols is anti-discriminatory and anti-misogynist. And a person who refuses to remove a religious symbol which is banned on the job is not being discriminated against. That person is excluding and disqualifying himself or herself. That person alone is responsible for his or her choices. One of the qualifications for the job is the absence of religious symbols. So if she or he refuses to respect that rule, she or he is unqualified for the job. It's a question of behavior. Banning religious symbols does not discriminate. It's not a discriminatory measure. It's a disciplinary measure. It's not about people. It's about behavior. Bans on religious symbols are like bans on religious symbols are like laws banning smoking in certain places. Such bans apply to everyone. Smokers are not excluded from those places. They just can't smoke. No one can smoke inside those places. Anyone who wants to smoke must leave the place temporarily and to smoke and then come back later. Bans on religious symbols are like speed limits on highways. The limits apply to everyone. To say that banning religious symbols discriminates against religious believers is like saying that speed limits discriminate against owners of high-performance cars. Also, rights and freedoms are rarely absolute. The rights of some end or start to be limited where others' rights begin, because there's often a conflict between incompatible rights, and some kind of equilibrium must be sought. Freedom of thought or belief may be absolute if there's no constraint on the person's mental processes, unless there's some kind of mind control or whatever going on. So that freedom of thought may be absolute, but never the freedom to put the thoughts and beliefs into practice. Freedom to practice something is never absolute. A ban for civil servants and teachers is a small and reasonable constraint on their freedom to practice their religion for a much greater good, to protect the freedom of conscience of users of civil services and students in the schools. These services exist to serve the users just as schools exist to serve pupils. They do not exist to provide employment. It is the freedom of conscience of users and pupils which is the higher priority. Furthermore, they're much more numerous than the employees. Wearing a religious symbol is a religious practice, not a religious belief. To limit the former does not affect the latter. Bill 21 does not in any way limit freedom of belief. Furthermore, the limit on practice does not apply when the person is off the job. And finally, a religious symbol can be removed. It doesn't require surgery to take off a crucifix or a hijab. Bill 21 is moderate, even timid. One of the judges, Justice Mainville of the Quebec Court of Appeal, on the 12th of December, the judgment of last December, when the Quebec Court of Appeal rejected the appeal by those who wanted Bill 21 to be suspended, he said several democratic liberal societies have adopted such measures, referring to bans on civil servants wearing religious symbols. There are bans on religious symbols in civil services and schools in France and in parts of Switzerland, Belgium, and Germany. Face coverings, including the full Islamic veil, are banned in numerous countries of Europe and Africa, including several Muslim-majority countries. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled in the past that it is legitimate to ban the Islamic veil worn by teachers in the Canton of Geneva in order to protect equality between women and men. And there are other cases in Europe too where such bans have been legitimized by the courts. So although Bill 21 is groundbreaking in North America, it's neither extreme nor exceptional. By European standards, it's rather banal and timid. Bill 21 is a question of professional ethics. To remove one's religious symbol at work is a form of professionally ethical behavior. To wear such a symbol at work is unethical and unprofessional. The Quebec Public Service Act, which has been in effect for many years, bans partisan political symbols and behavior for civil servants. It's much more restrictive than Bill 21. Bill 21 bans religious symbols for only part of the civil service. But a ban is necessary because religious symbols often have political implications, especially when they're worn in the civil service or in schools. Bill 21's ban is a benefit for everyone because it protects the religious neutrality of civic space. It is especially beneficial for children of religiously pious parents because having secular schools means a periodic break from the family environment without interfering in that environment. This is especially true for daughters because of the misogynistic nature of several religions. And finally, no religious practice is truly an obligation. Either it's a personal choice or it's an obligation imposed by a parent or co-religionist against the will of the person who is being forced. In the latter case, it's a matter of coercion which violates the freedom of conscience of the person. So if it's an obligation that should be removed. It's an obligation which denies the freedom of conscience of the person who's being forced. And finally, the secular state is not responsible for believers' choices. Believers themselves and not the state are entirely responsible for their religious beliefs and practices. The secular state is in no way responsible for the decision of a believer to wear a religious symbol and is in no way obligated to accommodate that choice. If the state allows its employees to wear religious symbols, it is acting as if the symbol were an integral part of the person wearing it, as if they could not wear it. Thus, the state essentializes the religious affiliation of that person, as if the affiliation were innate and immutable, like a genetic attribute, as if the obligation to wear the symbol were imposed by a higher power to whom it is impossible to say no. Thus, the state endorses the religion of that person. This is unacceptable for a secular state. Endorsing atheism or agnosticism would be similarly unacceptable. By banning religious symbols worn by employees, the state commits to treating every person equally, regardless of their belief or non-belief. Thus, the state commits itself to respecting the freedom of conscience of civil service users and school students. Now, what about arguments against Bill 21? Well, the arguments against are generally very weak or non-existent. There's very few of them. So opponents of Bill 21 often indulge in gratuitous, defamatory accusations, such as accusing supporters of the bill of xenophobia, racism, etc., etc. But if you set aside such defamation, I know of only one remaining argument against Bill 21 that has any plausibility at all. The law limits the freedom of religious practice or religious expression, or whatever you want to call it, of civil servants and teachers when they're on the job. This is true. But this argument ignores the rights of civil service users and public school students. It neglects them completely. The opponents of Bill 21 do not take into account those rights. They see only the limitation on the rights of the employees or on work, and completely ignore the freedom of conscience of civil service users and students. Because what we have here is a situation of conflicting rights. There's the employers on the one hand and the students and users on the other hand. We have to find an equilibrium. Bill 21 finds such an equilibrium. A modest limitation on the employee's rights, but only while they're on the job. Anti-secularists tend to be, in my opinion, very dishonest in their opposition to Bill 21 and to secularism. As I've mentioned earlier, they tend to conflate race and religion, which have nothing to do with each other. Thus, they negate freedom of conscience, because if you conflate race and religion, then religion becomes something sort of innate and unchangeable, and you're not recognizing the freedom of the person to do what they want, to leave that religion, to have another religion, to keep the same religion or whatever. It's their decision. It's not an innate part of them. But it's interesting to note that if we do allow this conflation between race and religion, the three Abrahamic monotheisms, those are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they become downright racist because, as you know, Judaism says that the Hebrews are the chosen people of God and the other people aren't. Christianity says that if you're not a Christian, you'll spend an eternity in hell. And according to Islam, according to the Quran, the Quran prescribes violence against non-believers in certain situations, even murderous violence. So, you know, if you're going to say that criticizing a religion or being hostile to a religion is racist, then those three religions are racist. So they should think about this before they start using this false equivalence. Also, as I mentioned before, the idea of religious obligations is a scam. The idea that, oh, you've got to allow this woman wearing a hijab to leave her hijab on at work. She can't take it off. It's a religious obligation. Well, no. If you take that argument, you're saying that the state is responsible for the religious choice of the person. And the state a secular state must not be held responsible for the religious decisions of an individual. They're responsible. So, you know, if they choose to wear something that conflicts with the job, well, they have to take it off when they go to work. They can wear it when they're not at work. It's also important to, as I mentioned earlier, not to conflate belief and believers, because we must be free to criticize beliefs without being accused of prejudice against people. We need to be able to say, criticize Judaism without being accused of anti-Semitism, etc. And also, every time I hear the word racialized, I think it's a whole scam because, as I said earlier, race is a biological concept. This whole business of racialization is closely related to the conflation of race with religion, which is very dishonest. And in particular, we all know about the Islamophobia scam. It conflates, just as I've been discussing, belief, Islam, with believers, Muslims. If there's prejudice against Muslims, it should be called anti-Muslim prejudice, not Islamophobia, in order to be clear that we're talking about prejudice against people. Also, the idea of fearing a religion, Islamophobia is used as if it's an irrational fear or a horrible thing. Well, to fear a religion is not irrational. It may be completely healthy. And if we're talking about a fundamentalist variant of religion, to fear that is prudent and frankly necessary. To fear a religious fundamentalism like Islamism or fundamentalist Christianity is a virtue. It's not a fault. Now, I'll look at two particular opponents of Bill 21. The Christian Legal Fellowship. They were lawyers for Trinity Western University, which you may have heard of, which is a very Christian institution of higher ed. According to them, if you see this quotation here, it's 2 paragraphs. They claim that Bill 21 bans citizens of certain faiths from public employment. They claim that neutrality is required of the state, but not individuals. They even claim that the purpose of religious neutrality is to promote and enhance religious diversity. And they also claim that Bill 21 bans religion from the public sphere. Those are all wrong, as we shall see. Another organization, Center for Inquiry Canada, which claims to be secular, it says a truly secular society does not give special treatment in the form of sanction, such as Quebec's Bill 21. People, including public sector employees, should not be treated differently if they are part of religion. Put simply, the state must always be neutral on issues of religious belief and must not treat someone differently because of their beliefs. This is what I referred to earlier as fake neutrality. What they're saying is that if you apply the same principle to everyone, then that's discrimination against people who used to have privileges. If you're allowing people to wear their own choice of religious symbol at work, then that's granting them a privilege. And if you take that privilege away, according to CFIC, that's discrimination. Well, I'm sorry. That's a totally backwards definition of neutrality. Bill 21 is religiously neutral in its ban. It applies to everyone. The ban applies to everyone, to all religions. So the Christian Legal Fellowship says that believers are excluded from certain jobs. No. Religious symbols are excluded from certain jobs. They just have to take them off. They say that the state must be neutral, not individuals. Well, the state only exists by virtue of the individuals who are its representatives. There is no state without its representatives. So those representatives have to be neutral too, or they have to be neutral. Otherwise, the state is not. They claim that religious neutrality is to promote religious diversity. This is complete nonsense. The purpose of religious neutrality is to avoid giving preferential treatment to one religion over others, or to give preferential treatment to religion over non-religion. It's not to encourage diversity. It's complete nonsense. And Bill 21, they say, bans religion from the public sphere. That is not true. I remind you of the diagram earlier of the 3 spaces. Let's see if I can get back to it. Yes, here. Whoops. I'm clicking my button too fast, sorry. I need to go more slowly. Okay, here we are, the 3 spaces. The public space outside, civic institutions, outside state and state and government institutions. Bill 21 does not apply there, except for face coverings for when people are using civil services, that's all. So this is simply not true, what they're saying. When they say that Bill 21 bans religions from the public sphere, that's false. And CFI Canada, this falsely secular organization, claims that Bill 21 treats religious believers differently from non-believers. No, that's not true. What it does, it removes a religious privilege, the privilege of being able to wear a non-neutral religious symbol on the job. If you were to apply their logic, think of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, the Pastafarian Church, as it's called. They would have to accept, for example, supposing I joined the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster and I was a policeman and I showed up for work wearing a colander on my head because that's my religion. I have to wear a colander on my head at all times. Well, they would have to accept this. So you'd see policemen and women walking around with a vegetable strainer on their head. They would have to accept that. This is nuts. They're just coming up with an excuse to hide their hypocrisy in claiming to be secular and opposing secularism. The final point here is the anti-secularism of the Christian Legal Fellowship is not surprising. It's a Christian organization. We would expect them to say nonsense about Bill 21. But CFI Canada claims to be secular, and it's not. Its hypocrisy is abject. It's disgusting, absolutely disgusting. Now, this is some material which I've added, which I did not include in the French language talk because, anyway, but I think it's important. I thought of it later. You've heard of the woke. If you've not heard, if you've never heard of it, the word woke means politically awake or aware, although it's bad grammar. It's a current in left-wing politics currently, which has abandoned the Enlightenment values of reason, tolerance, freedom, progress, universalism, human rights, and secularism. And and as such, it's basically abandoned the left. It's a form. The political left and right are defined by support for or opposition to Enlightenment values. If you support Enlightenment values, you're on the left. If you're against them, you're on the right. Those are the definitions, as I understand it. So a supposedly left-wing group that abandons Enlightenment values is no longer on the left. I'm not sure. They're in some kind of weird limbo. Maybe they're on the right or often never Neverland, but they're not left anymore. They're pseudo-left, post-left, whatever. But it's become dominant among political leftists and even centrists, and there's almost no real left. There is no left. Well, actually, I hope that's not true. I hope that's an exaggeration. I hope there is a true left still left, but it's not very vocal. We don't see much of it. This woke mentality, it's also known as the regressive pseudo-left or the anti-Enlightenment pseudo-left, and they hate secularism. Why? Well, let's take a look at the political and philosophical roots of the woke mentality. It's based on a number of things. Intersectionality, which you may have heard of. It's an obsession with personal identities, especially minority identities. There's multiculturalism, which you're familiar with, which is involves cultural relativism. It's an anti-universalist political ideology which attaches greater importance to ethnic or religious affiliation than it does to either universal rights or to citizenship. There is postmodernism, which is a philosophy associated with cultural relativism too. It's inspired by skepticism about modernist ideas of objectivity, rationalism, and knowledge. It's anti-modern or postmodernist. It rejects the modernist idea that there's such a thing as objective knowledge that you can search for. It's sort of postmodernists tend to think that knowledge or truth are like personal things. Like everybody has their own truth, and there's no common truth. It spells the death of knowledge. Post-Marxist defeatism, a degeneration of Marxism resulting from Marxism's failure to deliver on its promise of a brighter future based on Enlightenment values, and which has led to blaming the Enlightenment itself. This is also known as neo-Marxism, sometimes as cultural Marxism. I prefer the term cultural post-Marxism. And Islamoleftism. It's a further degeneration of post-Marxism, in which the priority traditionally according to class and economics is now replaced by the defense of minorities, especially Muslims. And speaking of minorities, the woke are obsessed with minorities. Intersectionality, multiculturalism, and the other ingredients make a toxic mixture which leads to an overemphasis on minorities and contempt for majorities and the universal. Some minorities are favored obsessively, granting them near impunity. When you add Islamoleftism to the mixture, Muslims are given special priority and impunity, especially the most pious and even fundamentalist. This leads to extreme complacency with respect to Islam and Islamism and condemnation of so-called Islamophobia. And then the whole process gets even more toxic by the non-recognition of some minorities. For example, Quebecers are dismissed as just other whites with all the negativity associated with that, while ignoring anti-Quebecois bigotry, which has been a theme throughout Canadian history and is used currently by the enemies of secularism to denigrate Quebecers and Bill 21 simultaneously. Secular Muslims are ignored. They don't fit the Muslim stereotype, which the woke insist on, where the women are veiled and the men are groomed stereotypically. Secular Muslims don't fit the woke stereotype of them, so they're ignored and dismissed. And ex-Muslims are denigrated. They don't fit the stereotype either. Now, in criticizing Bill 21, Bill 21 is sometimes said to be the tyranny of the majority. Well, not quite. There is a tyranny, but it's the opposition to Bill 21, which involves the tyranny of a majority. The majority being the rest of Canada vilifying the minority, Quebecers, for their progressive secular legislation. Although I hasten to add that there are many people in the rest of Canada who support Bill 21, but they're bullied into silence, unfortunately. There are many supporters of bans on religious symbols in Canada. It's something like 38%, according to a recent poll, and that goes up to 44% if you include Quebec. But according to this poll, it's something like 38% just outside Quebec, which is a pretty large minority. But we hardly hear from such people because the woke basically they basically censor everybody bully everyone into silence, because if you speak up, you're a racist, xenophobe, intolerant, Islamophobe, blah 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 blah. You know the story. You've heard the song many times. Now, the majority, the tyrannical majority, is allied with a tiny but very vocal tyrannical minority, Islamists. Secular Muslims are ignored. People like ACNEL, which is, perhaps you've heard of ACNEL, it's the Association Québécoise des Nord-Africains pour la Laïcité, which is part of the RPL, the Rassemblement pour la Laïcité, which we, LPA and AFT, participate in. It's a coalition in favor of Bill 21 and in favor of secularism in Quebec. There are many people from a Muslim background who support Bill 21, but they're ignored. And it's the Islamists who are anti-secular, who are allied with the so-called, what I call the woke people. And by the way, just to be clear, what I mean by Islamist, I mean any person who promotes Islam politically. Anyone who attempts to obtain political power, influence, or privileges for Islam. So, for example, I forget her name, but the MP who proposed the motion M103, which condemns so-called systemic racism and Islamophobia, I would call her Islamist because she is promoting, she tried to get and succeeded in getting a privilege for Islam, a parliamentary motion which condemns so-called Islamophobia. That, in my opinion, is the very definition of Islamism. Almost done. This is quite long. I hope you're holding up. I'm not boring you too much. There are 3 studies about attitudes towards religious symbols that have come out in recent years. And they gave us some interesting insight. The first one in 2018, published in the review Politics and Religion. It analyzes attitudes in Quebec towards banning religious symbols. And it concludes that people with liberal values like male-female equality, support for gay rights, opposition to racism, general liberal values would support banning all religious symbols, whereas those with illiberal values, they support only banning minority religious symbols. So, for example, they would support, like this was done a few years ago, they would support the charter that the PQ tried to pass a few years ago, but they would oppose removing the crucifix from the National Assembly. Now, these are people with illiberal values, and they would ban only minority religious symbols. So you can see that those who are in favor of banning all religious symbols are liberals in Quebec. The second study in 2018, a little later the same year, published in Nations and Nationalism. It came to the conclusion that the opposition to religious accommodation in Quebec correlates with low religiosity, not with racism. It's people who are not religious who oppose religious accommodation. It's not because they're racist or they don't like minorities or whatever. It's about religion. And finally, a more recent study last year in the Canadian Journal of Political Science, it studied people in both Quebec and in Canada outside Quebec. And they found, it's the title, A Tale of Two Liberalisms. They found that those with liberal values in Quebec generally favor banning religious symbols. Those with liberal values in the rest of Canada generally oppose. So they share liberal values in terms of, gay rights, women's rights, opposition to racism, social programs, but they have opposite attitudes towards religious symbols. So we're dealing with something that's particular to Quebec. But I also hasten to add that nevertheless, there are people outside Quebec who support Bill 21. They exist. They're a minority, but they're a large minority, but they're very silent because they're intimidated into silence. Summing up, those 3 studies I just talked about, they indicate that support for Bill 21 among Quebecers is not correlated with racism or other illiberal attitudes. I mean, as the enemies of secularism would like to tell us, that's nonsense. It's people who support it often have very liberal values. It's because they're in favor of freedom, and Bill 21 increases freedom by protecting the freedoms of users of civil services and students. And although they're interesting, they're nevertheless irrelevant to the validity of Bill 21, because even if Quebecers were racist or xenophobic or whatever, a bunch of 100% bigots in Quebec, Bill 21 would still be valid progressive legislation because it's not racist. It has nothing to do with racism. It deals with secularism and religion. It's not discriminatory. It applies to all persons and all religions equally. Bill 21's ban on religious symbols is a small, reasonable limit on religious practice, not on belief. It doesn't touch belief at all, for the protection of civil service users and students. So my conclusion, Quebec is in the vanguard of the Americas on the issue of secularism. Although I hear that Uruguay is very good too, but as modest as Bill 21 is, it's quite progressive for North America at least, and for most of South America. And I have some useful links, our websites, a reading list on Bill 21, a table of face coverings. There are many countries that have bans on religious symbols and face coverings. And also a request for any, if you are willing and able, if you haven't already done so, to contribute to our legal fund, because we are participating in supporting Bill 21 before the courts by opposing those who are challenging it and trying to have it struck down. So that's my talk.